When my ex-husband stood in family court and told the judge I had brainwashed our 12-year-old son against him, I thought I'd lost everything. But then my son asked to show the judge something on his phone, and what happened next left the entire courtroom speechless. Hi everyone, I'm Sarah, and I never thought I'd be sharing this story with anyone, let alone thousands of strangers on the internet. But if my experience can help even one parent going through something similar, then it's worth the vulnerability. What I'm about to tell you happened just 6 months ago, and it completely changed not just my life, but my relationship with my son Dylan forever. 2 years ago, I thought I was one of those lucky divorced parents. You know the ones, where both parties act like adults, put their kid first, and somehow make co-parenting work without drama. Michael, my ex-husband, and I had what seemed like a perfectly reasonable arrangement. Dylan would spend weekends with his dad, holidays were split fairly, and we communicated through a parenting app like civilized people. I actually used to brag to my friends about how mature we were being about the whole thing. Let me paint you a picture of our little family. Dylan is this incredibly bright 12-year-old who loves building things with his hands. He's constantly working on some new Lego creation or trying to fix broken electronics he finds around the house. He's got these expressive brown eyes that seem to take in everything around him, though he's always been on the quieter side. The kid notices details that most adults miss, which I used to think was just his natural curiosity. I had no idea how much that attention to detail would end up saving us both. Michael, on the other hand, has always been what I call a performance parent. He's the type who posts perfect pictures on social media of their father-son adventures, always makes sure other people see him at Dylan's school events, and has this way of making everything look picture perfect from the outside. He works in sales, so he's naturally charismatic and knows exactly what to say to make people like him. Even during our divorce, people would comment on how reasonable and involved he was as a father. I started to wonder if I was the problem when things began to fall apart. The thing is, I genuinely wanted Dylan to have a good relationship with his father. Despite our marriage not working out, Michael was still Dylan's dad, and I believed every child deserves to feel loved by both parents. I bent over backwards to make sure I never said anything negative about Michael in front of Dylan. When Dylan would come home from weekend visits seeming a little off, I'd tell myself it was just normal adjustment stuff. Kids need time to process big changes, right? But over the months, I started noticing things that made my stomach twist with worry. Dylan would return from his dad's house quieter than usual, more withdrawn. He'd spend hours in his room after these visits, and when I'd ask about his weekend, he'd give me these short, careful answers that didn't sound like him at all. My normally chatty kid was becoming guarded, and I couldn't figure out why. Then came the nightmares. Dylan would wake up in the middle of the night calling for me, but when I'd ask what was wrong, he'd just say he couldn't remember the dream. His grades started slipping too. Not dramatically, but enough that his teachers mentioned it during parent conferences. I scheduled counseling sessions thinking maybe he needed professional help processing the divorce. But Dylan would clam up during appointments and insist everything was fine. The worst part was watching my son's personality change. The curious, creative kid who used to show me every cool thing he built was becoming anxious and people-pleasing in a way that broke my heart. He started asking permission for things he'd never needed permission for before, like getting a snack from the kitchen or watching TV after homework. It was like he was walking on eggshells in his own home. I had no idea that Michael was systematically working to destroy my relationship with Dylan, using tactics so subtle and manipulative that even I didn't recognize them at first. And I definitely didn't know that Dylan was quietly collecting evidence of his father's true nature, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. That moment came in family court in front of Judge Patricia Harrison, when everything I thought I knew about my ex-husband's character was about to be shattered by a single text message on my son's phone. Let me take you back to the beginning of this nightmare, because understanding how we got to that courtroom moment requires knowing who I really am and what our life looked like before everything unraveled. I'm Sarah Chen, and at 34, I thought I had finally figured out how to balance being a single mom with rebuilding my own life. I work as a marketing coordinator for a small tech company here in Portland, which means I have the flexibility to work from home a few days a week, something that became crucial after the divorce. My days were structured around Dylan's schedule: school pickup, homework help, dinner together, and those precious bedtime conversations where he'd tell me about his day. After Michael and I separated, I made a conscious decision to focus on creating stability for Dylan. I kept us in the same house so he wouldn't have to change schools, maintained his friendships, and tried to keep our routines as normal as possible. I even started dating again, carefully and slowly, and had been seeing James, a gentle guy who worked at Dylan's school as a counselor for about 8 months. Dylan seemed to like him, which felt like a miracle given how protective kids can be after their parents divorce. Our co-parenting arrangement seemed almost too good to be true. Michael would pick Dylan up every Friday evening and bring him back Sunday night. We used a parenting app called Our Family Wizard to coordinate schedules and communicate about Dylan's needs. Michael was always punctual, always polite, and always seemed genuinely interested in spending quality time with Dylan. He'd take him camping, to baseball games, and on these elaborate weekend adventures that honestly made me feel a little inadequate sometimes. But here's the thing about hindsight. It has a way of connecting dots that seemed completely unrelated at the time. Those weekend adventures started feeling less like bonding time and more like competitions. Michael would come back from trips with Dylan and casually mention how much fun they'd had, how Dylan had said it was the best weekend ever, and how maybe Dylan needed more guy time, since he was living with just his mom most of the week. The first real warning sign I should have paid attention to came during a school conference in October. Dylan's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, mentioned that he'd been asking her strange questions about divorce and custody arrangements. She said he seemed anxious about whether kids could choose which parent they wanted to live with, and whether judges really listened to what children wanted. At the time, I thought it was just normal curiosity from a kid trying to understand his new reality. Around the same time, Dylan started having what I can only describe as emotional reactions to normal parenting moments. If I had to remind him to clean his room or finish his homework, he'd get this panicked look in his eyes and immediately comply in a way that seemed fearful rather than respectful. When I'd ask him about his day, he started giving me these carefully crafted answers that sounded rehearsed, like he was worried about saying the wrong thing. The nightmares became more frequent, too. Dylan would wake up at least twice a week, sometimes crying, sometimes just sitting up in bed, staring at nothing. When I'd try to comfort him, he'd ask me questions that broke my heart. "Mom, do you really want me to live here? Are you happier when I'm at Dad's house? Do you think I'm too much trouble?" These weren't normal post-divorce adjustment questions. They were the words of a child who was being told things that made him doubt his own mother's love. I started documenting these changes in a journal, not because I suspected anything sinister, but because I was genuinely worried about Dylan's mental health. I scheduled appointments with his pediatrician, researched child psychologists, and even considered family therapy. Every professional I spoke with assured me that behavioral changes were normal after divorce, that kids often act out their anxiety in different ways, and that time and consistency would help him adjust. But there was something else happening that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Michael's communication style began shifting in subtle ways. His messages through the parenting app became more formal and detailed, like he was creating a record of every interaction. He started questioning decisions I'd made for years: Dylan's bedtime, his screen time limits, even the food I packed for his school lunches. It felt like constant low-level criticism disguised as co-parenting collaboration. I had no idea that Michael was building a case against me, using my own son as his primary weapon, and that every one of Dylan's anxious questions was actually evidence of psychological manipulation designed to make me look like an unfit mother. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in February when I found the custody modification papers taped to my front door. Michael was seeking full custody of Dylan, and the reasons listed in the legal documents made my blood run cold. According to his filing, I was an unfit mother who had alienated the child from his father and was emotionally unstable and unable to provide proper care. I remember standing in my doorway, still in my pajamas, reading those words over and over again. How had we gone from seemingly cooperative co-parents to this? The Michael I thought I knew would never have ambushed me like this, but as I called my lawyer, Rebecca Martinez, in a panic, she explained something that made my stomach drop. "Sarah, custody cases like this don't happen overnight. He's been building this case for months." That's when I started connecting the dots that had been right in front of me all along. Michael's increased documentation of everything wasn't co-parenting diligence. It was evidence gathering. Those detailed messages questioning my parenting choices weren't collaborative discussions. They were attempts to provoke responses he could use against me. And Dylan's behavioral changes weren't just divorce adjustment, they were the result of systematic psychological manipulation. The escalation was swift and brutal. Michael began showing up at Dylan's school events unannounced, positioning himself as the concerned father who had to check on his son's well-being. He would arrive at soccer games and parent-teacher conferences with a notebook, writing down everything I said and did. Other parents started giving me pitying looks, and I realized he was telling people his version of our story, that I was keeping Dylan from him and poisoning our son's mind against his father. The worst part was watching what this was doing to Dylan. My son became an anxious messenger between two adults who were supposed to be protecting him. He would come home from visits with his father, carrying questions that no 12-year-old should have to ask. "Mom, Dad wants to know why you won't let him take me on the camping trip he planned. Dad said you told him I didn't want to go to his house anymore. Is that true? Dad thinks you don't want him at my school stuff because you're embarrassed of him." Every single question was designed to make me look like the villain, and I found myself constantly defending decisions I'd never made or explaining away accusations I'd never heard before. If I said yes to something, Michael would claim I was being manipulative by finally agreeing. If I said no, he'd tell Dylan I was being unreasonable and keeping them apart. It was emotional warfare, and Dylan was caught in the crossfire. The breaking point came during spring break. Michael was supposed to have Dylan for 3 days, but when Sunday evening came, he didn't bring him home. Instead, I got a text. "Dylan is having such a great time here. He doesn't want to come home tonight. I think he needs more stability in his life." When I called, demanding to speak to my son, Dylan's voice sounded strange and distant. "Mom, can I stay here a little longer? Dad says you're probably busy with work stuff anyway." That was the moment I realized Michael wasn't just trying to win custody. He was trying to replace me entirely in Dylan's life. He was slowly convincing my son that I didn't really want him around, that life would be better and easier if he just lived with his dad full time. The psychological manipulation was so gradual, so insidious, that even I had started doubting myself. Maybe I wasn't as good a mother as I thought. Maybe Dylan would be happier with more structure, more activities, more of the exciting adventures that Michael could provide. Rebecca helped me understand that what Michael was doing is called parental alienation, a form of emotional abuse where one parent systematically undermines the child's relationship with the other parent. She explained that alienating parents often appear charming and reasonable to outsiders while privately working to destroy the bond between the child and the targeted parent. They use the child's natural love and loyalty as weapons, making them feel guilty for loving both parents. As we prepared for the custody hearing, I felt like I was fighting a war with an enemy who had been planning his attack for months while I was still trying to keep the peace. I had no idea that Dylan was quietly watching everything, taking mental notes of his father's behavior and waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth about what was really happening behind closed doors. The custody hearing was scheduled for April 15th, and I had exactly 6 weeks to prepare for what felt like the fight of my life. My lawyer, Rebecca Martinez, had been practicing family law for 15 years, and she didn't sugarcoat the situation during our first strategy meeting. Sarah, parental alienation cases are incredibly difficult to prove. Alienating parents are often skilled manipulators who know exactly how to present themselves in court. We need concrete evidence, not just your word against his. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to have an honest conversation with Dylan about what was happening, despite every instinct telling me to protect him from the adult drama. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when my son was clearly suffering, and I couldn't fight for him effectively without understanding what he was actually experiencing. On a quiet Saturday morning, I sat Dylan down at our kitchen table, the same place where we'd had hundreds of conversations about homework, friends, and life. My heart was pounding as I chose my words carefully. "Dylan, I need to talk to you about something important. Your dad has asked the court to let you live with him full time. How do you feel about that?" The change in his expression was immediate and heartbreaking. My confident, articulate son suddenly looked like a deer caught in headlights. I don't know, Mom. Dad says it would be better for everyone if I lived there. He says you're stressed out from taking care of me all the time, and that maybe you'd be happier if you didn't have to worry about me so much. Those words hit me like a physical blow. Michael had been systematically convincing our son that he was a burden to me, the exact opposite of everything I'd ever felt or expressed. I took a deep breath and made a choice that went against every co-parenting book I'd ever read. I was going to tell Dylan the truth. Sweetheart, I need you to know something. You are not a burden. You are the best part of my life, and I would never be happier without you. If your dad told you that, he was wrong. I'm fighting this custody case because I want you here with me, not because I have to. I watched Dylan's face crumple as he started crying, not the quiet tears of a child, but the deep body-shaking sobs of someone who had been carrying a weight too heavy for his shoulders. Over the next hour, Dylan began sharing things that made my blood boil. Michael had been telling him that I complained about having to take care of him, that I was planning to move away with James and start a new family, and that Dylan was getting in the way of my happiness. Worse, Michael had been coaching him on what to say if anyone asked about wanting to live with his dad, including practicing conversations where Dylan would claim I was mean or never had time for him. But the most chilling revelation came when Dylan admitted that his father had been telling him to take screenshots of our text conversations and report back on what I said about the custody case. He said it was our secret and that it would help him take better care of me, Dylan whispered, looking ashamed. That's when I made a decision that Rebecca later called brilliant. Instead of being angry about the screenshots, I was going to use this situation to our advantage. I gave Dylan my old iPhone, ostensibly for emergencies, but really so he could document what was happening on his father's end. I taught him how to screenshot messages and save them to a secure folder, explaining that sometimes adults need proof when they're telling the truth. Dylan, I'm not asking you to spy on your dad or lie to him, but if he ever says or does something that makes you feel scared, confused, or sad, I want you to know that you can save those conversations. Sometimes grown-ups need to see exactly what happened to understand how to help. The week before the custody hearing, I made another crucial decision. Rebecca had initially advised against having Dylan present in court, but I changed my mind. If Michael was going to claim that Dylan preferred living with him, then Dylan deserved the chance to speak for himself. I had no idea that this decision would give my son the opportunity to show Judge Harrison exactly what kind of father Michael really was, in his own words. The morning of April 15th arrived with that heavy, gray Portland drizzle that seemed to match my mood perfectly. I sat in the family courthouse waiting area, my hands shaking as I watched Dylan quietly reading a book beside me. He looked so small in his button-down shirt and khakis, the outfit we'd carefully chosen together because he wanted to look grown up for the judge. Rebecca squeezed my shoulder as we entered courtroom 3B. Remember, Sarah, stay calm no matter what they say. Judge Harrison has been doing this for 20 years. She'll see through the performance. But as I looked across the room at Michael, sitting confidently with his lawyer, I felt my stomach drop. He looked exactly like what central casting would order for a responsible father. Press suit, perfect posture, and that charming smile that had fooled everyone, including me, for so long. Judge Patricia Harrison entered with the kind of presence that immediately commanded respect. She was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "This is a custody modification hearing for Dylan Chen Torres," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of hundreds of similar cases. "Mr. Torres, you may present your case first." Michael's lawyer stood up with a thick folder of documents. "Your Honor, we're here today because Mr. Torres is deeply concerned about his son's well-being. Ms. Chen has systematically alienated Dylan from his father through a campaign of emotional manipulation and psychological abuse." The words hit me like physical blows, but I forced myself to remain still, as Rebecca had coached me. Then Michael took the stand, and I watched in horrified fascination as he transformed into the perfect victim. "Your Honor, I've tried everything to maintain a relationship with my son, but Sarah has made it impossible. She questions every decision I make, undermines my authority, and has convinced Dylan that I'm the enemy. Last week, Dylan told me he was afraid to hug me because his mother might get upset. His voice cracked with what seemed like genuine emotion, and I saw Judge Harrison taking notes. Furthermore, Michael continued, Dylan has become increasingly anxious and withdrawn since living primarily with his mother. His grades are suffering, he's having nightmares, and he's lost interest in activities he used to enjoy. I believe he needs the stability and structure that I can provide in my home. Michael's lawyer then called their key witness, a child psychologist who had never actually met Dylan, but had reviewed evidence of my supposed parental alienation. In my professional opinion, the child shows classic signs of being coached against the father figure. The mother's behavior patterns are consistent with alienating parent syndrome. I felt like I was watching my life crumble in real time. Every accusation Michael made was a twisted version of the truth, and his performance was so convincing that I started doubting myself. Maybe I had been too protective. Maybe I had unconsciously influenced Dylan against his father. Then it was my turn. Rebecca presented our evidence methodically. The documentation of Michael's escalating behavior, the screenshots of his manipulative messages, and testimony from Dylan's teachers about his anxiety following visits with his father. But I could see in Judge Harrison's expression that it wasn't enough. It looked like a case of he said, she said, and Michael's presentation had been flawless. That's when Michael's lawyer made his final argument. Your Honor, this boy is clearly emotionally unstable due to his mother's influence. He needs immediate intervention and the consistent presence of his father to heal from this psychological damage. The words, emotionally unstable, applied to my sweet, sensitive son made something snap inside me. But before I could react, Dylan stood up from his seat in the gallery. Your Honor, he said in a clear, steady voice that carried across the silent courtroom. May I please say something? Judge Harrison looked surprised but intrigued. Young man, this is highly unusual, but if you have something important to share, I'll listen. Dylan walked toward the bench with the kind of quiet confidence that reminded me exactly why I was fighting so hard for him. Your Honor, I know my dad just said I'm emotionally unstable, but I want to show you something that might help you understand what's really been happening. He pulled out his phone with steady hands. Can I show you what my dad texted me last night? The courtroom fell completely silent as Judge Harrison took the phone. I watched her face transform from professional neutrality to shock, then to something that looked like controlled anger. She read the message once, then again, her expression growing darker with each word. Case dismissed, she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Mr. Torres, you'll be hearing from Child Protective Services. The silence in that courtroom after Judge Harrison's words was deafening. I watched Michael's face go through a series of emotions, shock, confusion, then a kind of desperate panic as he realized his carefully constructed facade had just crumbled in front of everyone. His lawyer was frantically whispering in his ear, but Michael just sat there staring at his hands like he couldn't believe what had just happened. The text message Mr. Torres sent to his son last night reads as follows, Judge Harrison announced, her voice steady but filled with controlled anger. Tell the judge you want to live with me, or I'll make sure you never see your friends again. Your mom doesn't care about you anyway. She just wants the child support money. She paused, letting the words sink in. This is not co-parenting. This is emotional abuse of a child. As we walked out of that courthouse, Dylan slipped his hand into mine, something he hadn't done in months. Mom, I'm sorry I didn't tell you about the other messages sooner. I was scared that if I said anything, it would make things worse for you. My heart broke realizing that my 12-year-old son had been trying to protect me from his father's manipulation. The drive home was filled with the kind of conversation I'd been hoping to have for months. Dylan opened up about everything, how Michael had been telling him I was planning to move away with James, how he'd been coached to act sad when talking about living with me, and how his father had convinced him that loving both parents was somehow disloyal. He would tell me that if I really loved him, I would want to live with him full time, Dylan explained. And when I said I loved you too, he'd get this disappointed look and say that meant I didn't understand what real love was. What struck me most was how Dylan had been quietly collecting evidence for weeks, taking screenshots not just of that final message, but of a pattern of manipulation that painted a clear picture of psychological abuse. "I remembered what you taught me about documentation," he said. "I figured if Dad was going to lie about you in court, someone should know what he was really saying to me." The immediate aftermath brought both relief and challenges. Judge Harrison issued a restraining order requiring Michael to stay away from both Dylan and me for 30 days while Child Protective Services conducted their investigation. Dylan's court-ordered therapy sessions revealed the full extent of the emotional manipulation he'd endured. Not just the obvious threats, but subtle forms of gaslighting that had made him question his own memories and feelings. But here's what surprised me most. Dylan bounced back faster than I expected. Within weeks of the hearing, his nightmares stopped, his grades improved, and most importantly, he started acting like himself again. He began showing me his Lego creations, talking excitedly about school projects, and asking for friends to come over, all behaviors that had gradually disappeared during Michael's campaign of alienation. The long-term consequences for Michael were severe. The Child Protective Services investigation led to supervised visitation only, which Michael ultimately chose not to pursue. His employer, learning about the court proceedings, placed him on administrative leave pending their own investigation. Sometimes the truth doesn't just set you free, it has real-world consequences for those who choose manipulation over genuine love. Looking back, I've learned that children are far more perceptive than we give them credit for. Dylan knew something was wrong long before I did, and he was brave enough to document the truth when the adults around him were failing to see it. I also learned to trust my instincts as a mother. Those subtle changes in Dylan's behavior weren't normal divorce adjustment. They were warning signs of psychological abuse that I should have acted on sooner. To any parent watching this who might be going through something similar, please know that you're not alone and you're not crazy. Document everything. Listen to your children's concerns. And remember that manipulative people often present themselves as the most reasonable ones in the room. The truth has a way of surfacing, especially when children feel safe enough to share it. My relationship with Dylan is stronger now than it's ever been. We've both learned that love isn't about choosing sides or proving loyalty. It's about creating a safe space where honesty can flourish. And sometimes, the most powerful evidence of that love comes from a 12-year-old's courage to speak up when it matters most. The text message that could have destroyed our family ended up being the very thing that saved us both. If this story resonated with you, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could hit that like button. It really helps other parents who might be going through similar situations find this video. And please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever dealt with parental alienation or manipulation in your own family? Your story might be exactly what another parent needs to hear to feel less alone. I know this was a heavy topic, but I truly believe that sharing these experiences helps break the silence around emotional abuse and manipulation. If you found value in hearing my story, please consider subscribing to this channel. I plan to share more real-life experiences and lessons learned, because sometimes the most powerful healing comes from knowing we're not the only ones who've walked these difficult paths. And remember, if you're currently facing a situation like this, document everything, trust your instincts, and never underestimate the strength and wisdom of your children. They see more than we think, and sometimes they're braver than we are. Thank you for listening to my story, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care of yourselves and your families.